It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Let's start today with that building collapse. Almost all of you know this, right? On Tuesday, the 37-story former Pfizer headquarters at 235 East 42nd Street, 2nd and 3rd Avenue, sparked a collapse scare and mass evacuations. It's right near Grand Central. As of this morning, it's been deemed, quote, safe and stable by the city's Department of Buildings after overnight repairs, though the investigation into what caused the structural failure is just beginning. This building is no ordinary construction site, and here's kind of the bigger arc of the story. It's a former office building being converted into more than 1,600 apartments, set to be the largest office-to-residential conversion in the country. Now, the developer, Nathan Berman of Metroloft, told the Wall Street Journal that he believes additional weight added during construction on the top floors likely caused the columns to buckle. He insisted that in, quote, 95% of the building, the structure is sound and intact, unquote. Now, over the past decade, few ideas in housing have generated more excitement, I think it's fair to say, than turning empty offices into apartments. After the pandemic hollowed out offices around the city, New York State and city officials rolled out tax breaks and other measures to encourage that kind of conversion. According to Gothamist, city data shows more than 3,000 apartments and condos have been added through office conversion since 2020, with more than 2,000 more under construction. Last year, the city rezoned a 42-block stretch of Manhattan to allow even more. So, to help us understand both the news and the bigger picture, we're joined by our own David Brand, housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist, whose latest piece asks what this near collapse could mean for the city's office-to-apartment push, and Peter Varsalona, a principal and vice president at Rand Engineering and Architecture, where he leads the firm's building design group. He's a licensed professional engineer who specializes in adaptive reuse and commercial to residential conversions. Think he's appropriate to this topic? Peter, welcome to WNYC. David, always great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
And listeners, help us report this story or ask your questions. Do you live or work near 42nd and 2nd? Were you evacuated Tuesday? What was that experience like? Maybe you live in one of the 3,000 apartments and condos that have been added through office conversions since 2020, or are you considering renting in one? Has this week changed how you think about that? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692, call or text. Also architects, construction workers, housing advocates. We invite you too. What do you think of the office-to-apartment conversion boom? What are your comments or concerns? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Again, you can call or you can text. David, let's start with where things stand this morning. What's the latest you're hearing on the building's condition and any ongoing impact for residents and businesses in the surrounding area?
Well, I just heard back from the Department of Buildings a little while ago about the current status of the Midtown office building that everyone is talking about, in not just here, but nationwide, it seems. They said that shoring is still ongoing, but they have shored up floors 11 to 27. This problem occurred on the 21st floor of the building, so they did the floors below, floors above. They're about to start 10. They're going to go down to the 9th floor and all the way up to the 37th floor in the rooftop today and in the coming days. As for the people in the surrounding buildings, I mean, most of the buildings are back open. There was still a hotel across the street that was under a vacate order. I think it still is. My colleague Brittany Kriegstein wrote about that, where a lot of the visitors, the guests staying at that hotel, got the unexpected surprise of having to suddenly move, and where a lot of them were transferred to another hotel in Times Square. But most of the buildings are open. 43rd Street is still closed.
So, Peter, for listeners who saw the images of a bent column through a 21st floor window on social media or on the news, can you walk us through what happened Tuesday from the 8 a.m. call to the FDNY to the evacuations?
I can try. It's obviously extremely disconcerting to see, to say the least, to see something like that. I don't think you would ever classify this as a typical construction mishap. This is a pretty serious and extraordinary occurrence. Whenever think about it as if you have to actually vacate and close off city blocks, you have a major incident. What occurred is, we don't really know. Obviously, the investigation is going to be. A lot of us in the industry are really going to be, watching it and curious as to see, is it design related? Is it construction implementation related? Did something happen where the sequence of the demolition or reconstruction in terms of the steel framing was altered in some way? There's just too many unknowns to really be able to determine the cause, but that's definitely going to happen. Right now, the focus is all on the shoring efforts, everything that's to stabilize the building. It seems like they have it kind of under control. They haven't reported any movement since that first occurred. To think about, when you look at the photo, it's really extraordinary to see buckling, like the failure of those columns and the sagging of those floors, which, again, 4 inches is pretty consequential. It's very noticeable, and you're gonna, there's gonna have to be a reconciliation on how to actually correct this. But it's I'm thrilled that no one was injured, and they seem to have done everything they needed to do to stabilize the situation, and that's going to occur over the next several weeks.
Well, as I said in the intro, the developer, Nathan Berman, managing principal and founder of Metroloft, told the Wall Street Journal that extra weight added to the top of the building likely caused the columns to buckle. And I'm sure I'm not the only one wondering what kind of extra weight and if that was necessary for an office to residential conversion in particular.
Well, I can tell you, Brendan, part of the scope was that this was both a horizontal and a vertical expansion of the building. I believe the building is quite large. You can look at it, on the internet. You can see the size of the structure. I think one part is now planning to be 37 stories. I believe they had a 4-story addition on the 235 portion of the building. Then there's another smaller portion that was 219. I think they're adding 19 stories onto that. So they completely changed the massing of the building to accommodate the proposed 1,600 apartments they're planning to build. And so there was major structural alterations being done in connection with this project. The weight characteristics, everything that Mr. Berman is talking about, would normally be designed and accommodated as part of the overall construction plan.
On adding all those stories to what was already a 33-story building, I guess to add more apartments, Jim in Brick has, I think, a very critical observation. Jim, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yeah, I'm hearing varying numbers. Brian, you just cited 33 floors. I read the Gothamist article. It sounds like there's a greedy objective here of the added weight is several floors on top of the existing building, which I've not heard a clear number. I don't know if the building was terraced and had different number of floors. I've heard it was originally 22, and they were adding 11 floors on top of that, and that would be reasonable why the beam on the 21st floor buckled, or the beams plural. We're not talking about like people making variations in plumbing. This is just outright stacking units, floors on top. I mean, I heard the number 7, not 33. If it was originally 22.
Jim, thank you very much. Well, you hear the allegation baked in there, David, that this is landlord-developer greed for wanting to add so much on top of an already tall building, so I guess they could rent or sell more units.
Yeah, and so to get to Jim's question, and thank you for your call and for reading the article, Jim. So the way this building is constructed is like a wedding cake. So it's wider at the base, and then it's terraced every few floors so that it gets narrower toward the top. And so as Peter said, they added 4 new floors to the very top to turn it from 33 to 37-story building. But then from about the 22nd up to that 37th floor is narrower, and so they they call it a bump out, where they horizontally expand the building for about 10 floors from the 23rd to the 32nd. And you can see in the photos and in our reporting that where the columns failed was directly below that horizontal expansion, where they expanded the building 10 stories right above where the columns bent.
So, Peter, I don't know if you've been watching this all along as an engineer before the problem began to manifest on Tuesday, or at least manifest to the outside world on Tuesday. But if you were, did you ever think, wow, that's kind of iffy to do the kind of additions that you both have been describing? They don't need to do that in order to make enough money on the building. This is greed, or at least this is unsafe. Or is this just something that, okay, you own the building, you want to add to it, you can add to it, and stuff happens?
Well, I think that it's very common for developers, first of all, that, when you think about the finances, they really need to maximize the viable residential FAR for area ratio for that particular building, right? If you look at the DOB site for the filings that were done, just the general construction component, they listed a $98 million cost for the conversion. And of course, that doesn't include all the other ancillary sprinkler, standpipe, and other work types that are filed with this. Plus, and that's only for permit required work costs. There's so many more costs on top of it. So this is serious money, and obviously they're looking for a consequential sale of something like 1,600 apartments, which again is can become very lucrative, but it's a high risk type of condo development. So they're going to maximize it. The fact that they were altering the framing of the building, it's not uncommon. This is done very often, and it's just a question, and that's what the investigation will find out is what actually failed, right? Because conversions, and this is something that I've talked about before, having a successful conversion project requires many different steps. It's much different than out of the ground construction where you control all the different components. Here you're limited by your existing building, and obviously anything you do involves cost. The engineers and architects, they're looking at everything, right? They're accounting for this. This is all supposed to be designed. And I think that's one of the part of the investigation is that review of those design and structural calculations is also going to be a review of the complete sequence of how this is supposed to be undertaken and constructed. There'll be a review of all the shop drawings necessary for how this is altered. Right? There's a whole careful process. There's so many different entities involved in a construction project like this. So something obviously failed. We don't know. It could be a series of different things. We just don't know that quite yet, and the investigation will tell us that hopefully soon.
Here's one technical question for you, Peter. Listener writes, please, please, please have your guest explain the difference between a beam and a column. Even the New York Times referred to a column as a vertical beam. Does that distinction matter?
I don't think it does that much here for the casual listener. I think it's basically a column is thought of as the vertical component, the vertical steel portion of the framing that brings all the loads down to the building's foundation. The beams are horizontal, and they pick up the floor loads and transfer them to the columns. I hope that's good enough for.
Yeah. Well, one engineer in David's reporting said a commercial building should easily handle residential use because it's a lighter load. Do you agree with that? And if that's generally true, what specific circumstances, or let's say circumstances specific to a residential conversion, could lead to columns buckling that way?
So it's really just about ensuring that the load path is being picked up by all the vertical columns. Yes, the questioner is correct in that the residential floor loads tend to be lighter than commercial floor loads. And residential loads usually about 40 pounds a square foot versus something that's commercial, which can go up to 100 or more pounds a square foot. But what you're doing is you're changing all the dynamics of a building, right? You're changing in this type of alteration where you're removing portions, you're adding large sections of additional loading, and you're trying to salvage columns, right? They look like those columns were existing; they weren't new. So, a lot of times, and that's what's part of the difficulty of these types of conversions of existing stock that's could be 60, 80, or 100 years old, is what was done in terms of the existing conditions, a survey, what probing was done to establish the condition of those beams, what testing, columns and beams, and what were the loads anticipated that those columns could carry. This will all be determined as part of the investigation.
David, a blunt question. Whose fault is this? Who's in trouble? Who, if anyone, is going to get sued?
Well, yeah, I think we're going to be in for a lot of litigation and a lot of finger pointing. The developer, as you mentioned, is saying that the load was too much for these columns. I've heard some speculation that that's already kind of starting to point the finger at maybe the structural engineer. But we don't know. The Department of Buildings has not released a cause yet. They're still doing their investigation. The speculation that I've heard is that this either happened because of some type of miscalculation on just how much load those columns could bear, or it could just be a mistake. Somebody messed up, didn't follow the plan specifications, or remove something. We kind of reminds me of about 3 years ago, there was a partial collapse at a apartment building in the Bronx, and turned out that the engineer at the time made a mistake and didn't realize the facade was load-bearing, and so he instructed the workers, or allowed the workers there, to remove bricks from a corner column that actually were load-bearing, and that was a huge mistake that led to part of the building collapsing. And so it could be something simple like that. There's just a lot of speculation, and we don't really know, but something definitely went wrong, obviously.
One listener writes, a lot of folks in health and the pharma community say the Midtown building is thanks to bad juju from decades of Pfizer policies and drug greed. Another listener who I don't think knows the detail I'm about to cite has some intuition that leads to it, it looks like. The listener just asks in a text, is the developer using union workers? And David, the buckling was first spotted, as I understand it, by a union steam fitter. And yes, the unions are pointing the finger at the largely non-union workforce. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so to my understanding, this was an open shop, meaning that there was a mix of union and non-union labor there. Yes, the steam fitter plumber was doing a lot of interviews, or at least one interview that went viral criticizing the developer for not hiring all union and saying that could have contributed to that. We don't really know whether that had an effect or not. I guess if there was fully union workforce, then maybe there's more of a mechanism for reporting problems, or more confidence in reporting problems, and kind of a chain there that you can raise problems to within a union. But yeah, we don't really know. We don't know the cause of this problem, and so I don't think you could say one way or the other.
Here's Patricia in Greenwich, an architect. Patricia, you're on WNYC. Thanks so much for calling in.
Hello. I'm an architect in Greenwich, Connecticut for residential houses, so I'm not fully knowledgeable about high-rise construction. But I do know that the wedding cake form in New York City is there because of the zoning regulations, so it won't feel so, like when you're on the street, we feel like being in a tunnel. So they set back, and quite a number of years ago they passed that zoning law. And I'd like to know how the developers negated that law so that they came up straight and negated that wedding cake look that is required. And perhaps people that know more than me about the New York City laws could comment on that.
Patricia, thank you very much. Who wants to take that? David, is that up your alley at all?
Yeah, I think I could take that. So Patricia's absolutely right. A lot of the zoning laws that we have had on the books were in response to a lot of those kind of more monolithic buildings. And there's one in particular, I'm forgetting which one exactly it was, that just completely blocked off sunlight. And so that's what led to a lot of these wedding cake style terraced buildings, including the building, this Pfizer building. The city has changed, or actually it was state law changed some of the rules allowing buildings in certain sections of the city, like Midtown Manhattan, to build to a higher floor area ratio, which is kind of a multiplier of the lot size. So this, I don't know the specifics of this project, but I think that they had more floor area ratio available to them, so they could build out, especially on those higher floors, while still maintaining terraces lower. They might have had that zoning capacity even before the state law changed. I don't really know, but I think they were able to take advantage of that.
And a listener writes, David, over and above the construction debacle, 1,600 apartments in one building? Unless they're only studios, and even if they are, that means the potential of between 3,200 and 4,800 new residents on that block. This is another listener who then accuses the developer of builder greed. It says builder greed without a thought for the social impact on the neighborhood, schools, playgrounds, grocery stores, etc. So for you as a housing reporter, what about that addition to one block?
So it's 1,600 units, not just in that building. I think Jim, when he called, this came up earlier in the program, that there's an adjacent building that they are adding additional stories to as well that will also have a number of apartments. So combined, it's 1,600 apartments. Yeah, I get what the caller's saying. That's always becomes a question, or I'm sorry, the listener who sent that message saying that always becomes a question with big new development. Like, can the infrastructure hold that? I mean, this is Midtown Manhattan, though, so I think that it's hard to overdevelop there. This is already the land of skyscrapers. This is 2 blocks from the Chrysler building. This is close to Times Square. It's pretty robust infrastructure. And I don't expect that to have such an impact in that neighborhood.
We're going to continue in a minute with our housing reporter, David Brand, and Peter Varsalona, Principal and Vice President of Rand Engineering and Architecture, where he leads the firm's building design group. He's a licensed professional engineer who specializes in adaptive reuse and commercial to residential conversions. And so when we come back, we're going to zoom out to David's reporting on this conversion craze. Are there implications from this structural failure for other conversions? A lot of people who are looking for housing and are interested in adding units this way to the city are asking that question now. So we'll try to get an answer from our 2 guests. We'll take more of your calls and texts, 212-433 WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We're talking about the building collapse scare on East 42nd Street this week, the mass evacuations there just east of Grand Central, and the larger picture of commercial to residential building conversions that may be implicated here, with Peter Varsalona, who is an engineer who specializes in commercial to residential conversions, and our housing reporter, David Brand. David, you've reported on the so-called conversion craze. How big has this office to apartment push actually gotten in the city by the numbers?
Yeah, it is an office to conversion craze, and you mentioned it in your intro that nothing, at least since I've been covering housing the past 6 years or so, nothing seems to get people as excited and energized and kind of interested as these office conversions. And it makes sense, especially coming out of the COVID pandemic. We had all of these empty office buildings or underused office buildings that were just sitting there. Meanwhile, we were having a serious housing shortage, so it just made perfect sense that we should fill those buildings with new apartments or condos. And we have seen projects and filings for new projects to get started have really picked up. So you mentioned 3,000 new apartments have been added in old office buildings since 2020. I talked with, that was what initially the Department of City Planning had told me a few days ago. And they said that was actually, they got back to me yesterday and said, actually, that was just as of January. We have more updated information now that there have actually now been 4,200 apartments and condos added in 10 converted office buildings in Manhattan and Brooklyn since 2020. In addition to that, there are permits filed or projects underway for 44 of these buildings, and that those will contribute a planned 13,700 new units. And so those are projects that are either already in development or the building owners have filed permits or received approval to begin those projects. So it's a big number.
You mentioned the demand for housing and the, almost desperate need for more housing in the city. So here's a text from a listener who pushes back on the other listeners we cited who claim this is about developer greed. Listener writes, with the current housing shortage and push to convert disused office buildings, it is weird to keep speculating that this mostly averted accident was the result of developer greed. This conversion is creating affordable housing in a neighborhood that generally doesn't have very much housing at all. Is it going to be affordable housing, though, David? Do you know?
Yeah, a portion of it is going to be affordable housing. There is a tax break program that the state enacted a few years ago called 467M. Just add that to our world of housing jargon and tax break numericals. But so yeah, that if you get that in exchange for that tax break, you have to reserve 25% of the new units as affordable housing, and I think affordable to people earning about 80% of the area median income. I don't have the numbers offhand right now, but I think that's for like an individual between $80,000 and $90,000. So there is going to be there. Well, we'll see when this finally gets built, but there will be some affordable housing as part of this project.
And David, recent reporting is that after the pandemic slump and fears even of that so-called doom cycle, as some called it, where in-person work in the Manhattan Business District permanently falls off a cliff and the domino effect of the rest of the city's economy with it, office leasing is actually booming. So was commercial to residential conversion just a craze, to use your earlier word, of a moment, or an overreaction, perhaps, that's now creating conflict over how much to keep it going if the city is also developing more office space?
Yeah, it's so funny how things can change so abruptly, that we were in a doom loop in New York City not too long ago, and now we have record high office leasing. And I just got an email from a brokerage earlier showing record high retail leasing. So things are looking good in that way. But there are a lot of older office buildings that I think are still pretty prime for these kinds of conversions, especially just based on like smaller floor plates where you could add more apartments without having to create some crazy jigsaws to try to give some access to windows, and just the way that those are constructed, and also not the most kind of prime office space. So while we might be seeing leasing increasing, especially in the newer types of office buildings, there's still a lot of older office buildings that are probably better suited for these housing conversions. So we're continuing to see these.
So, Peter, when your engineering firm evaluates an old office building for conversion, how do you determine what the existing structure can actually bear before you design anything? What does that pre-construction, pre-conversion investigation look like?
Sure. Well, one of the things you have to do is you really need to do probing. You have to expose the steel structure. You have to get the sizes of the steel framing. You need to then evaluate their condition, right? If there's any damage and any kind of repair or reinforcement that's needed. That, one of the key elements, right? I always, when I've spoken about these in the past, and there's really 8 key steps. And then the number one step is the assessing of those existing conditions. And it's not just the structure, it's MEP, it's all the other systems as well. But the structural framing is really critical. You got to have some understanding of the foundation. It can be very difficult, right? Because some of these buildings are so old, the records are not available, original, designers are not available. And you have to do enough due diligence to really get a good understanding of what the load capability is of the building. As David was mentioning, some conversions do very little structural work. One is because it's so expensive and disruptive. And some of these things are so unknown, it can be quite difficult to really get a handle on what those load capacities are. But when you're doing something more significant, where you're like for the one on East 42nd, you really have to do an extraordinary amount of preliminary analysis to really understand how the building is working. And it's hard because the difficulty lies is that you don't know a lot of the assumptions that were made during the different design discussions originally for that building. And, so now you're kind of working within the limitations of what may exist. But it's all part of the normal engineering process when you're doing a conversion. And there's so many other things that go into it. This is just one, the structural framing is just really just one component of a successful conversion project.
So David, one expert in your story, and I cited this earlier too, said converting a commercial building to residential should actually be safer because it's generally a lighter load for residential. Assuming that's true, should we conclude that this failure does not point to something that's a general risk that should leave people concerned about office to residential conversions in general, as opposed to something specific about this site?
Everyone I've talked to in terms of structural engineers, architects, construction experts say that it's rare and that this is probably some kind of one-off that was based on some type of major error. There are a lot of projects, as we've been talking about, that are currently underway or that have been completed and that have had a lot of pretty intensive demolition and renovations completed within the envelope of the existing building. I'm thinking of another building from the same developer, Metro Loft, on Water Street in the financial district, where they actually carved out a courtyard through the middle of the building and used they had that available density to add more floors on top. And that seemed to go off without a hitch. That building is open and currently leasing. Very dramatic work that was done there. And the reason they carved out the courtyard through the center of the building was to allow for more windows, because there are strict light and air requirements where you have to have windows for bedrooms, and so by doing that they could maximize the amount of apartments they had. But that's all to say that these are intensive projects, and I also wouldn't be surprised if it does lead to some type of reactive additional requirements when it comes to safety reviews, or a review or more intensive review of the projects that are currently in development.
Peter, for you as an architect, or an engineer, I should say, specializing in office to residential conversions, we know that there's this big push, often called the abundance movement, and Mamdani is in favor of it, as well as Governor Hochul, and it seems to span the whole left-right spectrum. Attempts to cut red tape of various kinds at getting residential construction or conversions approved and, actually built. But a listener writes, I've been told that the buildings department has long been a bastion of corruption. Could this have impacted the approval process? And the person adds, recent key initiatives to cut red tape include permitting and office conversions. New construction permitting timelines are cut by 5 months, and permitting for converting commercial office buildings into residential apartments have been shortened by 5 months. So are people racing to build, racing to cut red tape in any ways, in your opinion, that could have made this site, or might wind up making other sites, new or converting, less safe?
Well, just to point out one thing, I actually am a registered architect as well as a professional engineer, so I have both frameworks there. I can tell you that I disagree with this notice that there's all kinds of corruption going on at the Department of Buildings. I don't believe that's the case. I think most of the time when we are generating, and Rand as an entity files, hundreds of projects a year, they're not all massive conversions, but they, everything's done in a very professional way. You get comments, you get objections, you have to respond to it. The onus is on the licensed design professionals to make sure that you're complying, not just with code, which is the bare minimum standard, but all industry standards needed to have a successful design and construction. So I don't agree with that component. I do feel that there are steps certainly that allow for architects and engineers who have done their very high quality work to get expedited approvals. But generally speaking, the major renovations, the major alterations, like the one we're talking about, new construction, those are going, there is no expedited review for those. Those are going through, I don't know of any licensed design professional who is doing an expedited review of those types of construction projects. They're going through the normal process. So it does take time to get approvals. The DOB is also insisting on they used to allow you to file for foundation without having other components designed quite yet. Now they're asking for a lot more to be submitted. So there's no quick process that I'm seeing. And certainly on our projects, there's always a race to get the job filed, right? There's always a financial pressure to do that, but no one's putting their sign and seal on plans that aren't ready to go. So I think a lot of preparation is done for these types of massive projects. They do take a long time to design and prepare, not just for filing, but for bid and for construction. There is overlap in those different stages that allow you to pick up on things that may have to change. In terms of, what you can do, the city already has, certain requirements for quality control, particularly on structural reviews where you have to do a peer review by another outside or third-party consulting firm for jobs that are of a certain size, which is, I think that's one of the things that will be investigated here. Was a peer review done or not? And perhaps not if it's a conversion as opposed to new construction. That might be something that they can consider insisting on, that all kinds of that peer reviews be done for jobs of this type as opposed to just new construction. And that may, that'll be something that'll come up during the investigation further.
David, anything to add to that based on your reporting?
Well, I think the listener brings up a great question. I mean, there is all of this push to speed up processes, to get stuff built, as Mayor Adams used to say, and Mamdani has picked up a lot of those. And I do wonder, is this going to encourage or motivate elected officials to pump the brakes a little more and start to try to institute even more reviews or to slow some of these processes? And whether this was the result of something that was sped up or not, it may not matter if there's a lot of outcry saying, wait a second, we're pushing to move quickly. Look at what happened here. And so it's going to, I think that's why it's in everyone's best interest to just determine what happened here as fast as possible and release that information so we know exactly what went wrong.
One more call. George?
Absolutely. Just to add in.
Go ahead.
Just to add in is that, we don't know what the cause is. If the cause is entirely construction or installation side as opposed to design, then anything we talked about in terms of speeding up design had no impact. So that's why I agree that we have to wait.
One more call, and some people are bringing up other kinds of building failures or building risks. One texter cites a building downtown on Maiden Lane where they say they're, a big enough problem that a construction worker died. I don't know that story or if that's true. And George in Manhattan is going to cite a couple of other things from other cities. George, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Yes, hi. So the Millennial Tower in San Francisco, which was built, I believe, about 10 years ago, has been leaning and sinking for the last 10 years or so. And it's a 58-story building, and the engineers are saying that it's due to the fact that it's not properly anchored into the deep bedrock. Rather, it's anchored into the clay. And there were early signs of structural integrity early on when it was built. And those of us of a certain age, like myself, recall that Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City that collapsed, or at least the concrete platforms collapsed, killing over 200 people, and due to structural overload. So I'm wondering how that compares to what we're talking about now with the Chrysler Building.
Thank you for that question. Peter?
And I think that the geotechnical is a little bit different here. New York City was really blessed by having a tremendous amount of bedrock that the foundation is generally tied into. You're going to see, there's a lot of differences in the subgrade that allows New York City to have such large buildings. I don't think you're going to see something of that nature here. Obviously, terrible, historical, situation that occurred in Kansas City and elsewhere. But New York City is a kind of a different animal with regard to how structures are connected to the facade. I'm sorry, to the foundation.
David, one more question on the Department of Buildings from a texter. Listener writes, no corruption maybe, but are there enough inspectors for the volume?
Well, yeah, that's the problem. There aren't. Then I think the city council was pushing for City Hall to budget for more inspectors, and they didn't do that. And so, in a city this size with this many buildings, this many projects under construction, it would be probably in everyone's best interest to have even more inspectors.
David Brand, housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. You can read his reporting on the near building collapse on Gothamist, of course, and Peter Varsalona, principal and vice president at Rand Engineering and Architecture, where he leads the firm's building design group. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so, on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.